Well, friends, today we're going to switch things up. We're heading to another empire. This time we're leaving the Roman Empire behind and moving on to the Spanish Empire. That beginning, how it all started. The moments of the conquest of Mexico led by Cortés and a group of Spaniards who barely numbered more than 400. And we're going to do it with the help of the person who, in my opinion, is the best and most reliable of all the chroniclers who wrote at that time about what they saw and what happened. This is a soldier of Cortés named Bernal Díaz. He was a native of Medina del Campo. He went to America very young, at about 17 or 18 years old, and at 20 years old, he was already taking part in the first wars or the first skirmishes they had with the Indians, not only with Cortés's expedition. Before that, he was with two expeditions, let's say exploratory ones, with Francisco Hernández de Córdoba's in 1517, and then with Juan de Grijalva's in 1518. They weren't very fortunate on that occasion. They had some encounters with the Indians. Between the skirmishes with the Indians and the bad weather that accompanied them on some of those voyages, their success was very limited, but they did make first contact with the continent and discovered that there was more there than it seemed. Finally, in 1519, this man, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, joined Cortés's expedition, and he stayed with him for a long time, not only in the conquest of the Mexican Empire, but also in other expeditions, like the one he undertook against Cristobal de Olís, to the Ibueras, present-day Honduras and Guatemala, the province where he eventually ended up living and settling, since he lived for many years in the city of Santiago de los Caballeros, what they call Antigua Guatemala. He was a councilman of that city for more than 30 years and received some recognition from Philip II. Many years later, after he accomplished what he did, and he was never truly recognized, neither in time nor sufficiently, so that he could feel comfortable throughout his life. Although here in Spain he is really not very well known, in Mexico he is known and studied, and all kinds of things have come up about him. Some say he never existed and that Cortés actually wrote this. There is a French historian who, probably out of a desire for notoriety, has come to say that what Bernal says there was actually written by Cortés. This has no basis whatsoever, and fortunately, no one supports it. Among other things, because Bernal wrote long after Cortés died, and also tells things that Cortés would never say about himself. Because we are dealing with a man who, above all, feeling confused and offended by the stories being told about the conquest of Mexico, which do not match reality, tells what he saw and what happened. That's why we can trust this chronicle. He tells both the good and the bad. Well, there are testimonies about him from the judge Alonso de Zurita, also from Diego Muñoz Camargo, around 1526. There are even two letters signed by none other than Hernán Cortés himself and the Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, and in both Bernal's recommended to the monarch and the members of his Council of the Indies, in recognition of the merits listed there for the services rendered. He really never managed to get them properly recognized, as I have already said. Well, there are also several royal decrees in which certain favors are granted to this man, the records and letters from the Guatemala City Council, in whose sessions he participated as one of its councilmen. So, for someone who supposedly didn't exist, there are more than enough references to him, of course. And, of course, we can't take seriously the idea that it was Cortés who wrote this story, neither the claim itself nor the person who says it. The fact is that although the conquest took place around the 1520s, this man began to write in 1551. This account of events, that is, 30 years later, because his achievements had not been recognized. And he writes it in pursuit of the justice he was owed. As he himself says, justice had not been done to him until then. And in fact, very little was done for him afterward, which is also common in our country. Almost everyone who has done great things for Spain is usually forgotten. That's when they aren't directly cast aside. And the fact is that this man starts writing an account of his military exploits to support a new petition over his poverty, because this man was poor. By that time, as he said in his letters, there were very few survivors left from those campaigns. It wouldn't have cost much to acknowledge them and give them some rewards, since most of them had already died. In fact, these first writings about this story, he called them memorial of the wars, because what he was trying to do was write about the merits he had earned in those conquests. But while he was working on that, a book called Hispania Victrix by Francisco López de Gómara fell into his hands. This is the official historian of Cortés, so to speak, who tells of the greatness of that conquest and the great deeds that Cortés accomplished in those campaigns. This man is filled with anger, among other things, because he sees that the soldiers who took part there are ignored, not even mentioned, and also that many of the things being told are false. They didn't happen that way. Among other things, because Mr. López de Gómara was never there, of course, and he had based his account on testimonies that he had embellished quite a bit. Other historians followed López de Gómara, as it's common in historiography to repeat and cite previous works, which lets errors persist indefinitely. So this man takes that draft, which he had already started working on, and decides to turn it around. To begin with, in the title, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, and not the things people are saying out there. People who know how to write very well, and not an uneducated fool, as he used to say, meaning himself, who had to have some scholars there in the Guatemala area review his text to correct some expressions that weren't right and some other things. But in the end, it became the most authentic chronicle, and one that really must be taken into account to clarify the reality of these events. The fact is that this is a text that should be required reading in all schools in Spain, and here we are, 5 centuries later, where practically no one knows about the existence of this soldier chronicler. It's surprising enough that they even know who Cortés is, even if only superficially. The details are largely unknown to the general public. Well, finally, around 1629, it finally made it into print and was circulated, although not sufficiently, both in mainland Spain and in New Spain in the Americas. In any case, to move forward, the harsh life of Bernal Díaz del Castillo is truly admirable, as he had 1,000 encounters throughout his youth. In war, he risked his life every day. For many years, he took part in many truly heroic deeds. But did he receive little or no reward for all of it? However, we are dealing with the most accurate, extensive, and above all selfless account of the conquest of New Spain. Throughout the entire writing, he repeatedly shows his personal appreciation for Hernán Cortés. Mind you, he was decent about that. But he never forgave him for caring so little about the fortune of those who accompanied him, and he really never forgave him because he says it many times throughout the text, that he exposed them needlessly, putting their lives in danger in some of the skirmishes that, as he says, were very poorly regarded and very inconsiderate. I'm not going to tell you about the conquest of New Spain in this episode. Here I'm only going to talk about these aspects that can be gathered from Bernal Díaz del Castillo, which I think are just as interesting as they are misrepresented by so many historians on both sides of the Atlantic. And while I tell you a bit about this process and what happened there and what they found and the impact that what they found in that absolutely unknown continent had on these people, I have to read you some things from Bernal Díaz del Castillo himself. You'll notice that the Spanish is sometimes Old Spanish, but it's perfectly understandable. And I'll start with this last point I mentioned, with these complaints that those who had risked their lives daily in battles that truly became hellish at many moments were not sufficiently recognized for their service. And it goes like this, for example, in chapter 196. I'll pick out different passages to explain this. While Cortés was in Castile, the Royal Audiencia came to Mexico, and as soon as they arrived in Mexico, all the representatives from the main towns and cities who had gathered demanded the repartimiento perfecto. What does the repartimiento perfecto mean? They wanted villages of indigenous people to be distributed to them according to the merits each of the old conquerors had earned, as he called the first ones who arrived, who were truly the ones who risked their lives and fought in a tremendous way, especially because there were already so few of them left. This repartimiento meant that a number of villages were granted to these gentlemen as encomiendas, and they could collect taxes from the indigenous people who lived in those villages. And furthermore, they not only had rights over those villages, they also had obligations. They were required to defend them in case of problems with neighboring villages or with other Spaniards who might want to harm them or cause some damage. They were also obligated to ensure their evangelization. That is to say, the conquest of Mexico was not only a territorial conquest, a conquest in which the aim was to give new lands to the crown, which in fact happened vast and immense territories. But above all, it was about the moral duty of evangelization. At that time, that was the prevailing way of thinking and almost the main undertaking. In that way, the territory that was being added was being administratively organized. However, it was not achieved. In the end, the distribution was not carried out, and around the 30s or 40s, things remained as they were. It got to the point that he was forced to travel to Spain to seek justice. He wasn't very successful either because he returned to Guatemala and began to write a long account of events to prepare a new defense and a new request for a reward for himself. Well, he even goes so far as to say that at that time, Mr. Nuño Guzman, president of the Royal Audiencia, actually did more good for them and fulfilled more of His Majesty's orders in giving out Indians than Cortés himself, since he could have done it much better than anyone else during his time in command, but he didn't. Let's see if Cortés himself would say that about himself. Even so, he says, since we Spaniards are so loyal because Cortés was our captain, we were fond of him, more than he ever had the will to do us good. Watch out. Even though His Majesty ordered him to, and he could have done it when he was governor, he constantly reproaches, between the lines, or even explicitly, that he left them poor, and that 30 years later they still had to keep begging for someone to compensate them with something, because they had risked their lives for so many years and had not received any reward for it. You see, I start with the reproaches this man leveled at Cortés. He also says on another occasion that during the distribution of the gold, when they took out what Moctezuma was keeping and had hidden during the Noche Triste, it was lost. At that point, there were 1,300 men, and half of them were lost. And most of the riches they were trying to carry off sank to the bottom of the lake. But even so, a little was left to divide among themselves. Also, both in that distribution and in other negotiations they carried out, which is what they called negotiating with the Indians, he complained that Cortés took a fifth for himself at the same time as he took the royal fifth for the king, which was mandatory. That is, 20% for the king, another 20% for himself, and the rest he distributed. He says, and that's not fair. He shouldn't be taking a fifth for himself. Anyway, he also reproaches him, of course, for having put their lives in danger in such a reckless way, as I mentioned to you. He mentions a case which he actually brings up several times throughout the work, in an area called Yotepeque. There were some Indians there on a rocky outcrop, on a cliff, on a hill up there, who were very well defended, and it was absurd to try to climb up to them, to attack such a position. However, Cortés couldn't think of anything else to say, and he literally says, "It seems that all these Mexicans take up positions in fortresses and mock us because we don't attack them." And then Cortés said, well, it's better if we go in and start climbing up to them. They were really a bit perplexed and said, look, Señor Cortés, they're going to fry us. They're in a position that can't be attacked. The thing is, they climbed up, and of course, Bernal says, the Indians threw so many big stones and boulders that it was terrifying how they came tumbling and bouncing down. It's a wonder they didn't kill us all. And it was a reckless thing and not agreed upon for the captain to order us to climb up. And he reproaches him for this at least 3 or 4 times throughout the whole work. This episode really left a mark on him. Well, we came down all battered and bleeding, with the flags torn, and 8 dead. And when Cortés saw us like that, he gave many thanks to God, though a bit late, after everything had happened. There's yet another episode he reproaches him for as well. Over in chapter 175, they arrive at a place called Zaguatan. This is already much later, during the expedition they made to Guatemala. The thing is, they arrive at a village, but by nightfall all the natives had left. They fled and hid. And after crossing a river where many dangers occurred, a huge river, well, Cortés couldn't think of anything else but to send them to search the mountains for these natives, to see if they could bring them back peacefully, and to have them give them food or guide them, because that was truly a catastrophic and harsh expedition. And Bernal himself says what he ordered was very inconsiderate and of no benefit at all. And the soldiers who went to search, we crossed that great river with a lot of effort and brought back 7 chiefs and some common people with very little benefit again, because they soon ran away again, and we were left alone and without guides. In other words, they risked their necks for nothing. Therefore, we see that these kinds of anecdotes that Bernal tells about Cortés are completely at odds with the idea that someone even close to Cortés would have written or requested such a work from Bernal Díaz del Castillo. Let's move on to another point. As I was saying, the importance of the religious aspect throughout the whole process, the evangelizing factor, was very important to them. These matters had already been addressed first in the laws of Burgos, then in the Valladolid debate. During the conquest, there were several processes that tried to regulate how it should take place, and therefore, both the monks who accompanied the expeditions and the will expressed by the king prevented conversion by force. And this is stated on several occasions, but these were people of great faith. Bernal Díaz himself mentions this in those war encounters where no one would have bet on the Spaniards' victory, and yet they won. He even says that either St. James or the Virgin had interceded for them because it was practically impossible for them to have come out of that skirmish alive. There are some very important anecdotes in this regard. More or less in order, once they land in Veracruz, they first end up in Zempoala. They have a skirmish with the people of Zempoala. It's the first town that in some way allies with them. After pacifying Zempoala, they headed to Tlaxcala, and on the way, they came across a town called Zocotlan, whose chief was named Olintecle. There were also emissaries from Moctezuma himself there, and that's when this anecdote takes place. When they are there, and he expresses his willingness to go to Mexico to speak with Moctezuma, Cortés says to them, "Let it be known that we come from distant lands, by order of our king, and send word to your great Moctezuma not to sacrifice or kill any Indians, nor to rob his subjects, nor to take any lands, and so that he may obey our king and lord." He says to him, "And now I say the same to you, Olintecle, and to all the other chiefs who are here, that you stop your sacrifices, and do not eat the flesh of your neighbors, nor commit sodomy, nor do the shameful things you are accustomed to, because this is what God our Lord commands." And he explained many other things to them concerning our holy faith. I am reading you Bernal's account just as it is, and they remained silent about everything. The newcomers were just as new to them as what they were encountering was to the newcomers. And Cortés said to the soldiers who were there with us, "It seems to me, gentlemen, that there is nothing else we can do but to put up a cross." And Father Fray Bartolomé del Medo, who was the priest accompanying this first expedition of the 400 and some men, replied, "It seems to me, sir, that in these towns it is not the time to leave them a cross in their possession, because they are somewhat shameless and without fear, and since they are vassals of Moctezuma, they might burn it or do something bad to it." And this was said to them, "It is enough until they have more knowledge of our holy faith." And Bernal says literally, "And so the cross was not put up." But of course, the clash of these two cultures was truly shocking. For most of those Indians, the Spaniards were kind of tools, gods who came from where the sun rises and apparently had prophecies telling them this was going to happen, and that these men were going to dominate them. For the Spaniards, those Indians, even though they had cities that amazed them with temples, houses, and an impressive scale overall, the cities were well organized, truly impressive. They had terrible customs, truly incompatible with the morals of that time, and even with those of today. So, through Bernal, you can clearly sense the emotional impact that seeing a culture that practiced terror against its own people had on the Spaniards. The clash with a cannibalistic empire, which is what it was, that practiced the greatest and most bloodthirsty rituals and sacrifices without limit, using human lives. And he tells us in chapter 61, for example, "We entered the land of a people called Zocotlan, and I remember that in a square where there were some shrines, there were so many piles of skulls from the dead that they could easily be counted. According to the arrangement in which they were placed, it seemed to me that there were more than 100,000, and I say again, over 100,000. And in another part of the square, there were just as many piles of shin bones and bones of the dead that could not be counted. And they had many heads hanging on some beams from one side to the other. And those bones and skulls were being guarded by 3 priests, who, as we understood, were in charge of them. Those were the priests of those religions. Because of this, we had to look more closely, and after we went further inland, we saw that all the towns were like that, and it was the same in Tlaxcala. That is to say, there were no exceptions. Not only the Mexicas and their allies practiced these customs. In Pole, it was exactly the same. In Tlaxcala, all the ethnic groups of Mesoamerica had these kinds of religions where these terrifying acts were practiced. And so, in chapter 92, it tells us how our captain went out to see Mexico City. Once they had entered Mexico City and were settled, they took a walk to see what it was like. Are we talking about Titlan? He went out to see the city of Mexico and Tlatelolco, which is the main square, and the great temple, that large pyramid, of their Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli is the Spanish version of that terrifying god to whom they made sacrifices. We went to another temple where great Mexican lords were buried, who also had other idols, and everything was full of blood and smoke. And they had other doors and figures of hell. And then next to that queue, there was another one, full of skulls and leg bones arranged in great order that could be seen, but they couldn't be counted because there were so many. And the priests were there with their long robes made of dark blankets, their hair very long and so tangled that it couldn't be spread out or untangled. And they all had their ears cut up and a lot of blood in their hair. That is, it seems the priests would cut their own ears. And all their hair was dirty with blood, all tangled because they spent the whole day throwing blood into the air with those still beating hearts they took from the chests and so on. This had a huge impact on the Spaniards. Now I'll tell you how Bernal himself, as he admits, had real psychological problems after seeing this. They tell us in chapter 152, the Mexican Indians defeated Cortés and took 62 of his men alive to be sacrificed. Many times he mentions these poor 62 soldiers whom they saw with their own eyes from afar as they were sacrificed. There's actually a very interesting movie from which you'll be seeing images as I speak called Apocalypto. Most likely it is based on the accounts of these chroniclers. Mel Gibson made an amazing movie in this regard. It's true that it seems to take place in Mayan territory and not Aztec. In any case, the settings and the actions are the same. The thing is, as Bernal says here, the drum of Huitzilopochtli sounded again, along with many other small drums, conch shells and horns, and others like trumpets, and all their sounds were frightening and sad. As you can see, they had rituals that must have struck fear into locals and outsiders alike. And we looked up at the high queue where they were playing them, and we saw that they were forcing people up the steps with shoves and slaps and sticks to our companions who had been captured in the defeat they dealt Cortés, and they were taking them to be sacrificed, and that they already had them up on a small plaza that was made in the shrine where they were.
Sus malditos ídolos vimos.
They put feather headdresses on many of them, and with something like fans they made them dance in front of Huitzilopochtli. And when they had danced, then they laid them on their backs on top of some stones that they had made for sacrifices, and with some flint knives they sawed open their chests and took out their beating hearts, offering them to their idols that were present there. And the bodies, they kicked them down the steps, and there were other butcher Indians waiting who cut off their arms and feet, and they skinned their faces and tanned them like glove leather, and kept them with their beards for celebrations when they held drunken feasts. Just imagine that description. And they ate the flesh with chilmol, and in this way they sacrificed all the others and ate them. Legs and arms and the hearts and blood they offered to their idols, as I have said. And what about the bodies, the bellies, and the guts? They threw them to the tigers and lions and serpents and snakes that they kept in the house of beasts, as I have said in the chapter where I talk about it, which I have mentioned before. Indeed, he describes how, when they enter Mexico, he is amazed that they have a huge zoo with all kinds of animals, many felines, and other types of beasts, large serpents, and so on. And when they ask how they feed these creatures, they say, well, with the parts of those we sacrifice that we do not eat ourselves, the guts, bodies, and torsos. And indeed, that's what he saw them do with his 62 companions. And he says, well, the threats they made to our friends, the Tlaxcaltecas, who were already allies of the Spaniards at that time, were so grievous and cruel that they made them faint. And they threw them roasted legs of Indians and arms of our soldiers and told them, eat the flesh of these tools and of your brothers, for we are already fed up with them, and with what is left you can also fill yourselves. This was psychological warfare, true psychological warfare against the enemy. It was an empire that practiced terror to subdue all the tribes that were their enemies. And this is what the Spaniards found in that territory. So much so that in other adventures and with other figures that we won't discuss this time, like Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, when he got lost in Florida and spent 8 years traveling all over North America, he kept encountering different tribes. Each one spoke a different language. He was made a slave several times. He was forced to work as a slave. But the fear he constantly expressed was that he might encounter what they already knew a bit further south, which were these tribes that ate people. And fortunately, he didn't encounter them because the Native Americans of North America didn't have that custom. They had other customs. They were people who were somewhat less advanced. They were in the Paleolithic. Really, they didn't have large towns or big cities like in the Mesoamerican area. But they were lucky that they didn't practice these terrifying acts and didn't eat their fellow humans, which was already important for Cabeza de Vaca. Even so, those good savages of the north had much worse luck than those of the south, because their territory was eventually occupied by Anglo-Saxons, who had much less respect for the lives of the indigenous people, and above all, no law to protect them. From the start for them, only a dead Indian was a good Indian. It didn't happen like that here. Despite the atrocities they encountered, the Spanish made them subjects of the crown and prioritized intermarriage above all. In fact, some of them even became nobles there, in their own land. They were never illegally deprived of their lands. In fact, not even the poor Spaniards conquered anyone. There were only 400 of them. It was the alliance with the Tlaxcalans who accompanied them, who ended the Mexicas, and who ultimately managed to pacify all of Mesoamerica through alliances. Yes, they changed their customs, and we must acknowledge it. Today, some people think it's wrong. They long for these things I'm telling you about. But anyway, let's move on. In the final moments of the conquest of Tenochtitlan, in chapter 155, Bernal tells us, and Cortés decided that we should go in until we reached Tlatelolco, that main square. And he says, in those temples there were some beams, and on them many heads of our soldiers, who had died and been defeated in the previous battles. And their hair and beards had grown much longer than when they were alive, and I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it, says poor Bernal. And I recognized 3 soldiers, my companions, and when we saw them like that, tears came to our eyes. We continue this story because it's important that people know this. Already in chapter 208, when he gives a sort of summary of what they found and what that was, what it meant for him to come across that, for him and for the others, of course, he says how the Indians throughout New Spain had many sacrifices and depraved practices, and we put an end to them and taught them the holy tenets of sound doctrine. And he says, and even though it cost the lives of almost all my companions, because very few of us survived and those who died were sacrificed, and with their hearts and blood offered to the Mexican idols, which were called Descarados, Catapuca, and Huichilobos. I'm sure they said something like that, not exactly like that. I want to begin by saying that the sacrifices we found throughout the lands and provinces we conquered, sacrifices and evils, because every year just in Mexico and certain towns around the lake, their neighbors, according to what I found, they killed over 2,500 people, both young and old. Well, in other provinces, by this count, it would be much more. Besides this, most of them were sodomites, to such an extent that boys would go around dressed in women's clothing to perform that diabolical and abominable task. And it continues. Well, eating human flesh, just like we get beef from the butcher shops. And in every town they had thick wooden structures, like houses or cages, and in them they would put many Indians to fatten them up. When they were fat, they sacrificed them and ate them. And besides this, the wars that provinces and towns waged against each other, those they captured they would seize, sacrifice, and eat them. As for carnal excesses, sons with their mothers, and brothers with sisters, and uncles with nieces, many were found to have this vice, this depravity. As for being drunkards, I can't even describe it. So many filthy things happened among them. But I want to mention just one here. We found in the province of Panuco that they would funnel wine into themselves through their anus with some tubes, and their bellies would swell with the wine they made among themselves, just like when we take medicine, a depravity never before heard of. These things that this man saw and describes, and other chroniclers of the time recount exactly the same, are now denied by some Mexican historians. It's curious.
Pero la historia es así, cada uno.
He paints it to suit his own interests. This man had no reason to make this up. He's just telling what he saw. And in fact, archaeology is proving that this was exactly the case. As you can see in these images, the excavations in Mexico City itself, in the area of the Templo Mayor described by Bernal himself, of the so-called Zompantli, from a limited excavation. Really? And despite all the skulls that the Spaniards would have removed at the time, and aside from everything that appears in the codices from that period. And what about the representations in other temples around the country where these rows of heads are carved in stone? Obviously, they are showing us that they had a certain cult around these things, collections of skulls. The man even says that after 2 years, when most of the lands were at peace, some good Franciscan friars came to New Spain, who set a very good example and taught good doctrine. And then, 3 or 4 years later, other good friars from St. Dominic, Dominicans, came, and they rooted it out completely. That is to say, evangelization came and these customs had to be forgotten. Well, and Bernal tells us because when the beginning is good, the middle and the end are all worthy of horror. He goes on to say that the end justifies the means, which can be seen by curious readers in the civility, Christianity, and justice we showed them in New Spain. That is, when he is writing around the year 1550 from Guatemala, he says, "Take a tour around all of New Spain. You already know that New Spain practically reached up to the north of the United States and down to the Isthmus of Panama. And even at that time, take a tour and see how they live now, how they lived before, and what they do." The psychological impact I mentioned affected more than just this man. He shares his story, but it likely happened to everyone. He says, "I want to share a very reckless thing that happened to me. And it's that after I saw them open up their chests and take out their hearts and sacrifice those 62 soldiers that I mentioned from Cortés's force whom they had taken alive, and offer the hearts to the idols." And what I'm about to say now, some people think it's because of a lack of courage. How every day I saw our companions being taken to be sacrificed, and I feared that one day or another they would do the same to me, because they had already taken me twice, and by God's will I escaped, and I remembered those horrible deaths. And as the saying goes, the pitcher that goes to the well many times and so on, that's exactly how it goes. He says, "From that time on, I feared death more than ever. Before going into battle, I would feel a kind of dread and sadness in my heart, and I would urinate once or twice." Notice the trauma these people had acquired from witnessing that. "And I would commend myself to God and His Blessed Mother, Our Lady, and entering the battles was all the same. And then that fear would go away, of course. In battle chaos, your mind wandered. You focused on survival, no longer caring what would happen if they caught you." That is to say, these people ended up traumatized by what they saw these Indians doing, these other cultures they had worked with, something unheard of for them, something they had never heard of happening anywhere else in the world. An empire that was practicing terror against its enemies, against its own people, and of course against those who had come from outside. And even if today they want to spin it another way, it's just as this gentleman says. That's why it's so important to turn to these chronicles from eyewitnesses, which are absolutely rigorous. I don't want modern historians saying that only happened occasionally. It clearly says it happened everywhere, all the time. No, but only some of them ate that. No, here it says that everyone ate it. And who are we going to believe? The one who saw it and told it selflessly, even without any reward for it? Or those who are making it up now? That's how history is, my friends, as they tell us. Be careful, let's go to the sources. And even among the sources, let's be critical because some are trustworthy and others are not. This isn't the only chronicle describing these atrocities. Bernal also mentions another Franciscan friar, Toribio de Benavente, Motolinia. The nickname they gave him was Motolinia, and Motolinia himself writes, and in this letter to the emperor he says, "Know, your grace, that when the Marquis of the Valley," he's talking about Cortés, who ended up with this title there in Mexico, entered this land, our Lord God was greatly offended, and men suffered extremely cruel deaths. And he recounts, the predecessor of Moctezuma, Lord of Mexico, offered the Indians in a single temple and in a sacrifice that lasted 3 or 4 days, 80,400 men who were brought to be sacrificed through 4 streets in 4 lines until they reached the idols to the place of sacrifice. And he confirms what Bernal says. And when the Christians entered this New Spain, in all the towns and provinces there were many sacrifices of dead men, more than ever, who were killed and sacrificed before the idols. And every day and every hour they offered human blood to the demons everywhere and in every town throughout this land. Well, this was the happy Arcadia in which the indigenous people lived when the Spaniards arrived. And I don't know if this current indigenous movement that's going around is longing for this with great nostalgia for those times. Well, I don't know. I really don't know exactly what it is they're asking to revive. And yes, it was the Spaniards who took these customs away from them. That's undeniable. Now, that's a far cry from López Obrador demanding an apology for what they did. On top of that, he said Spain or the King of Spain had to apologize or something like that. I'm not saying the Spaniards didn't do anything wrong, but in any case, the descendants of those who did something wrong are still there. Because Mexico is the result of that transformation of those indigenous ethnic groups who committed those atrocities. And from then on, they did other things. And if someone has to apologize, then let those whose last name is Lopez start, and then Obrador, for example. Because the vast majority of us who live here in Spain, our ancestors were never in America. And now it seems that his successor, Claudia, what's-her-name, repeats the same things, showing the same serious lack of documentation as Mr. López Obrador. But our Mexican brothers will know well that any reasonably intelligent person will never identify a people with the stupid things their rulers do or say. And it's better that way because in Spain we're no less affected than in Mexico. Well, and having said all this, indeed, just as Bernal himself makes clear, Cortés's mission was primarily to make all those peoples swear allegiance to the King of Spain. He always avoided the destruction of cities or the needless killing of their inhabitants. And Bernal explains this perfectly throughout his entire true history. The key was the alliance policy he devised with all the other peoples who were already enemies of Moctezuma. In fact, Moctezuma only allowed him to enter Tenochtitlan when a large part of the enemy peoples, or those he had already subdued, had already allied themselves with Cortés. He realized things were getting serious and said, let's see what this guy wants. Let him come and tell me. In the end, we must admit Cortés was a great strategist. Of course, it was the only possible way to get right into the heart of Tenochtitlan. And indeed, the prospect of ending the Mexica reign of terror made many peoples ally themselves with Cortés relatively quickly, not without first having resisted or clearly seen that the military power of so few men, barely 400, was significant, and that they carried weapons that from time to time could do some real damage. But even so, if it weren't for that strategy and that policy of forming alliances, going from town to town until gradually constraining the Triple Alliance of Mexica power, none of that would have progressed at all. And of course it's worth highlighting, as Bernal himself recounts, the deep-seated hatred that the Tlaxcaltecas held toward the Mexicas. That was really one of the driving forces that led them to ally with the Spaniards against them. To such an extent that when Tenochtitlan was taken, Bernal describes the great indiscriminate massacre they carried out among the entire starving, unyielding population, and the impossibility of preventing it, because the Spaniards didn't want them to carry out that massacre. They had a different objective, but it was impossible. At that time, the Spaniards numbered around 1,000, possibly more, and brought over 100,000 Tlaxcaltecas with them. They couldn't stop them from taking revenge themselves. They had been subjected for centuries and had witnessed the terror inflicted on their people, although they were just as ruthless with the other enemies they captured. And that was really shocking for Bernal and everyone else, seeing how they killed each other in such a brutal way. That's probably the reason why most of the descendants who remain in Mexico today are Tlaxcaltecas, and also from other ethnic groups. But today, there are very few Mexicas left, because in addition to the great massacre carried out against them by these Tlaxcaltecas, they ended up as an almost marginalized people. Besides, they were not the most numerous in Mesoamerica, not by a long shot. That's the great paradox that today this country called Mexico is named after them, when in reality it could have been called Tlaxcala, for example, with much more merit than any other name. Well, there are many anecdotes that show us that the Tlaxcaltecas, quote-unquote, liked the Mexicans. Here, for example, in chapter 156, when he talks about his friends Chichimecatecle, the younger, the old man, the blind one, the younger one, the young man, etc. These are all Tlaxcaltecas, all among the first allies. After Tenochtitlan was conquered, Cortés spoke to them and thanked them profusely and praised them warmly because they had helped us. And since they were rich with clothes, cotton, gold, and many other valuable spoils, they returned happily to their lands. That is, the Tlaxcalans took everything they could get in Mexico and went back to their land. And they even carried many loads of dried meat made from Mexican Indians. Look, they were carrying arms and legs made into jerky to eat them. They shared them with their relatives and friends, and since they were from their enemies, they ate them as part of celebrations. Because it's true that these ethnic groups, these tribes, only ate their enemies. At some point, he even says that after conquering Mexico, many died of hunger because they didn't eat each other. They only ate their enemies. Well, even after months of alliance with the Tlaxcalans, they kept taking the meat to eat. That is to say, it wasn't immediate for them to get rid of that custom of eating human flesh. It took some time. Another very interesting aspect that we can learn through Bernal himself, because he was naive in his narration and just told things as they were, is the topic of slavery. Indeed, slavery, although it was already prohibited by the laws of Burgos during the time of Isabella the Catholic, and it was ratified in the Valladolid controversy, in the new laws, and in other regulations that were made. But slavery existed especially by right of war and in cases of, let's say, serious crimes committed by the enslaved. Of course, in the indigenous world, it was absolutely common, and the treatment of slaves in the indigenous world was truly terrible. They even gave them to one another as if they were necklace beads. Bernal describes this well. It's necessary that at some point in your life you read Bernal, if possible, in its entirety. Today there are even free audiobooks available online, and it's easy to access them. He tells us, for example, in chapter 194, "Meanwhile, while Cortés was in Castile with the title of Marquis, the royal audiencia came to Mexico, which we have already talked about, and they did not make the perpetual distribution that Bernal and other conquerors wanted. The fact is that those gentlemen of the audiencia did not do things properly. They did not do what they had been ordered to do, and orders arrived to remove them immediately and to appoint others." Bernal Díaz concludes this case. What ruined them was the excessive license they gave to brand slaves, because they gave out licenses by the bucketful, and they sold them. The servants of Nuño Guzman and Delgadillo, who was the other member of the audiencia. And in the case of Panuco, so many were branded that they nearly depopulated that province. This means that they almost depopulated that province. And then, seeing the reports and letters that were sent against them, His Majesty and the members of the Royal Council of the Indies ordered that, without further delay, the entire royal audiencia be dismissed and its members punished, and that they appoint another president and judges who were knowledgeable, of good conscience, and upright in administering justice. This happened to them because they had handed out licenses freely to enslave people. He ordered them to go to Panuco at once to find out how many thousands of slaves had been branded. Then, the permits that had been issued for branding slaves were declared null, and it was ordered to break all the iron brands used for marking slaves, and that from then on, no more slaves would be made. A record was also ordered of all the slaves in New Spain to prevent them from being sold or moved to another province. And in addition to this, he ordered that all the distributions and encomiendas of Indians that Núñez Guzmán had given, that is, the audiencia that the king himself had ordered, and the other judges, relatives, and favorites, or their friends, or other people who had no merits, that then, without being heard any further, they should be taken away from them and given to the people His Majesty had designated, to those who deserve them. Note how the king's favorites, the royal audience and the royal court, broke laws and overstepped, leading to punishment. Guzmán, their debts, favorites, and orders were involved, and Núñez also acted wrongly. This is very interesting.
Y debe saberse, porque este era el
the legal behavior that the Spanish crown had there. Another thing is the excesses that someone committed. If they were known and it was possible, they were punished. But even so, slavery existed, and in many cases, orders were given to towns that, having already pledged obedience to the emperor and allied with Cortés, later rebelled and even committed major crimes, such as attacks on Spanish towns, etc. These people, once defeated, as we will later see Cortés himself tells us, were often made slaves. However, except for these occasions I mentioned, the enslavement of the Indians was not only not allowed, but it was also looked down upon, and it was even considered honorable to fight against it. Even Bernal Díaz del Castillo himself, while he was in Guatemala, in this chapter 123, which is not in the first edition I mentioned to you, the one that was printed, but it is in the Guatemala edition in what is called a final chapter. In the part Bernal added, he talks about himself, and he says that being a councilman of that town, he broke the iron with which the Indians who were turned into slaves were branded. That is, he tried to abolish slavery to put an end to injustices. He reported to the new president of the Second Audiencia of Mexico, and he even dared to give him advice. He says, "We humbly beseech you, by way of sound counsel, to expressly order that no more slaves be branded throughout all of New Spain." This was exactly what Bernal himself was trying to achieve, because it was also what the laws ordered. It was the will of the crown at that time. And if that was happening, it's because slaves were indeed being branded. Injustices were being committed, but it was not something ordered by the crown nor institutionalized. They were cases that happened unjustly, precisely. And he says more, and after seeing our letters, he wrote to us that we had acted as very good servants of His Majesty, thanking us greatly. And then the judge Ramirez de Fuenleal ordered that no more Indians be branded anywhere in New Spain, nor in Jalisco, nor in Tabasco, nor in Yucatan, nor in Guatemala. It even seems that as a reward for his advice granted by the very president of the Audiencia, Bernal Díaz del Castillo was appointed as general inspector to prevent Indians from being branded. That is to say, we are dealing with a man who, after the trauma he suffered as a soldier from having seen those terrible things, almost became a protector of the Indians. Hernán Cortés's own letters of relation, which are 5 letters he sent recounting all the events of the conquest to Charles I of Spain, also mention this issue of slavery. Of course, I can read you some paragraphs. For example, the first letter of relation already says that Moctezuma wanted to be your Highness's vassal, and that I should see what he wanted to give your Highness each year as tribute, in gold as well as silver, precious stones and slaves. That is, he offered to give slaves to the emperor as tribute. In the 4th letter of relation, for example, he says, speaking of a town called Tututepeque, that's what he calls it. He rebelled again after having sworn obedience to His Majesty. He rebelled again, and the Lord came down from His land and burned more than 20 towns. Those of our friends, that is, other Indians who were already allied and pacified. And he killed and captured many of them, and that's why I reconquered it, says Cortés in this 4th letter of relation. The Lord was captured, along with his younger brother and another of his generals, one of those who had committed these outrages. The said Lord and his captain were then hanged as punishment. It was a common punishment at the time, obviously. They didn't exactly go easy on these kinds of things during the conquest. And all those who were captured in the war were made slaves. There were up to 200 people. Here, it clearly says how he made 200 people slaves because of war and conquest, after they had rebelled and committed great outrages against the Spanish and their allies. They were branded, that is, they were marked with a hot iron. Your Highness, he said, and it was an iron in the shape of a G for war, with which they were branded, and in that way they became slaves. And in another episode, also talking about slaves, he mentions certain small islands that are in front of that port of Honduras, which they call the Guanaxos, that some of them are uninhabited because of the raids that have been carried out on the islands, and many natives have been taken from them as slaves. And in some of them, there were still some people left. And I learned that from the island of Cuba and from Jamaica, they had again sent expeditions to those islands to finish devastating and destroying them. And as a remedy, I sent a caravel and ordered them on behalf of your majesty not to go to those islands or harm the natives, because I intended to pacify them. That is, to bring them over peacefully. That is, no, your majesty. In other words, instead of waging war against them and making them slaves, the just cause was to offer them peace, make them subjects of the crown, and prevent further disorder. This is Cortés himself, the one who boasts before the king of having done this work against what the governors of Cuba were trying to do, which was to destroy those people by making them slaves. However, in the 5th letter of Relation, for example, he says, certain people and settlements called Chichimecas are very barbaric and not as reasonable as those in these other provinces. And he says they are instructed to do everything possible to pacify them.
Y traer a la obediencia,
Your Majesty, and to settle among them in the place they find most suitable. And if they do not find them willing, that is, if they are not interested in peace and in being subjects of the crown, nor do they wish to be obedient, then they should wage war against them and take them as slaves, so that there is nothing superfluous in all the land, nor anything that does not serve or acknowledge your majesty. But the truth is that in the face of all this issue, and promoted, well, why not say it? Initially by Spaniards themselves, by some Spaniards, this black legend appeared, right? About the atrocities they claimed happened there and so on. One of them was the famous preemptive attack on Cholula. In Cholula, they set up an ambush for these 400 Spaniards who had just left Tlaxcala on their way to Mexico, and they weren't killed by sheer luck because they were alone at that moment. The Tlaxcaltecs forced them to stay behind. They didn't let them enter cities that weren't yet allies. And that's exactly how Bernal Díaz del Castillo tells it. However, figures like Bartolomé de las Casas appeared, who at one point became a defender of the Indians. He also wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies. There's Histories of the Tlaxcaltecs, written by a Tlaxcaltec. What about that one? He greatly exaggerates many events, saying and claiming that the Indians had suffered atrocities and such, which is not true. And it is proven by others who were eyewitnesses that it didn't happen that way. Because among other things, everything de las Casas wrote about, he did not witness himself. He writes based on hearsay and makes up things that aren't true. At first, all of this seems like he was doing it in defense of the Indians, but he probably had other more questionable interests, like advancing his own position. For example, as a clergyman, this man became Bishop of Chiapas, almost without merit, according to other clergymen who knew him well. We'll discuss that now. But Bernal Díaz del Castillo himself knew de las Casas. Of course he did. In fact, at one point, de las Casas acted as Bernal's own representative to help him obtain some privileges for his services as a soldier, and so on. So he knew him perfectly well, firsthand. He still complains about him, especially the lies he tells, because he lived through it and knows things didn't happen, as de las Casas says. And in chapter 83, when he talks specifically about the preemptive attack they had to carry out in Cholula, Bernal says in chapter 83, and I think the curious readers are tired of hearing this account of Cholula, and I can't help but recall here the thick wooden cages we found there. You know they put people in there to fatten them up, right? Which cages we broke, and the Indians who were imprisoned in them, Cortés ordered them to return to their native lands. And he says,
pasemos adelante y digamos.
These were the great cruelties that the Lord Bishop of Chiapas, Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, writes about and never stops talking about, because he claims and says that without any reason, just for our amusement and because we felt like it, that punishment was carried out. He writes about it in his book so convincingly that people who didn't witness it will believe it really happened. And other cruelties he describes are the exact opposite, and it didn't happen the way he says it did. Bernal says all this since he has read the book. He already has Bartolomé de las Casas' book in his hands, and he says, "What is this guy saying about us? He's discrediting us, claiming we committed crimes there that never happened." And he defends himself by saying that some good Franciscan friars, who were the first friars His Majesty sent to New Spain, went to Cholula to find out and investigate how that punishment happened and for what reason. And the investigation they carried out was with the same elders and leaders of that city. And after learning everything from them, they found it to be exactly as I describe in this account. Not as De las Casas says, but as I stated, it was a preemptive attack.
Porque nos querían matar y tuvimos
To capture the caciques, the important ones, and to punish the generals. That way, the rest of the troops who were prepared to kill them in an ambush were already neutralized. And he says, and if that punishment hadn't been carried out, our lives would have been in great danger, given the squadrons and companies of indigenous warriors they had, from the Cholula natives as well as their walls and supplies. That if there, by our misfortune, they had killed us, this New Spain would not have been conquered so quickly, nor would another fleet have dared to come. In other words, they barely escaped. And this is what Las Casas uses to claim that the Spaniards killed countless Indians in Cholula as they pleased. Of course, who would speak ill of this enterprise that Spain was carrying out in Mesoamerica? Well, a Spaniard, as usually happens. And something similar happened, as you know, in Mexico when Cortés had gone out to defend himself against Pánfilo de Narvaez because he was also coming to get rid of him by order of the governor of Cuba. At that moment, he puts Pedro de Alvarado in charge of the government. And when he returns, he finds out that Pedro de Alvarado had to fight against the leaders of the Mexicans because they were setting up an ambush for them, something similar to what happened in Cholula. Obviously, Cortés gets very angry and doesn't quite trust that this was really the case. However, Bernal does say so. Some people say that Pedro de Alvarado, out of greed for the large amount of gold and valuable jewels that the Indians were dancing with, went to attack them. I don't believe it, nor have I ever heard such a thing, nor is it believable that he would do such a thing, even though Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas says so. That is, that version also comes from him. That and other things that never happened. The truth is, he attacked them so they wouldn't come to attack him. And as they say, whoever strikes first wins. A preemptive attack, according to Bernal. And we also learned for a fact that Moctezuma never ordered such a war. That's how it is. And that when Pedro Alvarado was fighting, Moctezuma would order his people not to do it. He learned this from people who had stayed there and told him, since he had left with Cortés. But in any case, the role that De las Casas has played in the history of Spain during this period and afterwards, because he is one of the originators of the Black Legend. That is, his work was later used by the enemies of Spain. It's something that's worth analyzing. That's kind of what I'm doing. Fray Toribio Motolinia himself even wrote a letter to Emperor Charles of Villiers, warning him about the role that Las Casas was playing, and that he certainly did not deserve to be made a bishop, but quite the opposite. So we can get a better sense of who Toribio Motolinia was, let's go directly to chapter 171 of Bernal Díaz del Castillo. It says, Fray Toribio Motolinia and the caciques and lords of Mexico gave him this name Motolinia, which means the poor friar, because whatever was given to him in God's name he gave to the Indians, and sometimes he would go without eating, and he wore very tattered habits, and walked barefoot, and he was always preaching to them, and the Indians loved him very much because he was a holy person. This was Toribio de Benavente, Motolinia, and he is the one who, observing Bartolomé de las Casas, warns the emperor and says, "Be careful with this one, because what he is doing is practically high treason." He says in that letter to the emperor, he says that always, even today, the Indians are being tyrannized. He also says this goes against your majesty, he tells the emperor. He also says that everything the Spaniards have, there is nothing that wasn't stolen. And in this,
injuria a vuestra merced y a todos los...
They pass through here, both those who brought property and many others who have bought and acquired it justly. And de las Casas dishonors them in writing and in print. And he says, how can a bold man defame the Spanish nation with its prince like this, when tomorrow the Indians and other nations will read it? He is directly calling him a traitor, he is saying. But how did they make this man a bishop, when, according to this testimony, he had already earned the gallows by then? And he describes de las Casas a little, saying that he has known him personally. And he says, I told de las Casas, as a father, all your zeal and love that you say you have for the Indians ends up in making them carry loads. And he says, you alone have more Indians carrying loads than 30 friars, and it would be better if you paid all those you work and exhaust, since you do not pay them. He was shameless. In fact, Bartolomé de las Casas had an encomienda and treated his Indians very badly. Be wary of him. He says more. When he went to Spain and returned as a bishop, he took 120 Indians to carry loads without paying them anything. Now, with your grace and the Council of the Indies, he tries to ensure that no Spaniard here can make even one Indian carry a load. And now they ask, there are only 3 or 4 to carry the bed and the food, because you can't find them along the roads. In other words, he takes 120 Indians, practically as slaves. He doesn't pay them and opposes others hiring Indians for good wages. He claims they're now paid well, and they take 2 or 3 of them to carry supplies along the roads. This was Father Bartolomé de las Casas, and the work of this man, as Toribio de Benavente perfectly understood, served so that the worthless nations, the Spanish enterprise in New Spain, especially those nations, that instead of being a generative empire, in the words of Gustavo Bueno, like the Spanish Empire was, or like the Roman Empire had been, they created their own absolutely predatory empires, like England, like France, like Holland, and not to mention the Belgians in Africa. Those are the ones who later allow themselves to say that the Spanish Empire was an atrocity, completely twisting history. But both the way Spain carried out the conquest in America and the laws that later protected the inhabitants of those areas made them subjects of the crown, promoting racial mixing, mestizaje, and therefore equality among all the inhabitants there. They point out that not only the intention but also the result was quite the opposite. Here intervened
Precisamente una serie
intellectuals, let's call them that, philosophers from the school of Salamanca,
fueron los que pusieron orden.
Spanish enterprise. The conquest was even halted until, in Valladolid, in a so-called controversy over just titles, it was decided how it should be and whether Spain had the right to continue with that conquest. Let's contrast this with what England always said, and later the United States and North America. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, period. That's why there are so few complaining in the North. There was no one left for that to happen. Well, the point is that the School of Salamanca, for those who don't know what this is, I'm going to talk a little about everything. Let's say that in the modern era of colonialism, in modern times when almost all countries wanted to have territories in America, Spain was the only European nation where a large group of intellectuals questioned the legitimacy of a conquest, instead of trying to justify it with traditional reasons. In this Valladolid junta that I mentioned, 1550 to 1551, the debate between Ginés de Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas was famous, and several disciples of Francisco de Vitoria, who had already passed away, also took part. He was the one who had shaped this doctrine of what is called the Law of Nations, the first law of nations known to have existed in the world. This happened in Spain. Spaniards don't know any of this because historians over the past centuries have made sure not to pass it on. It may sound absurd, but that's how it is. Notice that Francisco de Vitoria had begun the analysis of the conquest and dared to deny that the bulls of Alexander VI, which were a kind of donation bulls, where it was stated that whoever conquered that territory had the right to it. He had denied that those bulls were a valid title to the ownership of the discovered lands, and for him, neither was it acceptable to force the submission or conversion of the Indians. since they were free by nature and legitimate owners of their properties. And it was they who had to voluntarily accept the Catholic faith. Similar, right, to what we are told or to what others have done in their empires. In a way, Francisco himself provided a series of reasons to justify the dominion over the discovered lands, which were a kind of legitimate titles of dominion. And look at what they consisted of, for example. The first is the right of every human being to travel and trade in every corner of the earth. If the natives did not allow free passage, those who were attacked had the right to defend themselves and to keep the territories they obtained in that war. In the second title, he said that the natives could voluntarily reject conversion to Catholicism, but they could not prevent the Spaniards' right to preach. And there were other titles in which it said, for example, that if the native rulers forced the converts to the Catholic faith to return to idolatry, it was also a title that in some way authorized the Spaniards to defend themselves or to wage war against that ruler. Or, for example, if in the encounter with that society it was observed that there was tyranny or harm done to innocents, it was referring to the sacrifices. They realized they were sacrificing their fellow human beings. For Francisco de Vitoria, this was considered a right of conquest over those groups. And also because of allies or friends who were attacked, like the Tlaxcalans, allies of the Spaniards, but subjugated along with many other peoples by the Mexicas. That is, the moment Cortés formed alliances with other peoples, it gave him the right to attack the enemies of those peoples. Obviously, with only 400 people, he could do nothing more than act as a strategist and leader. The ones who really bore the brunt of the attack were the allies, of course. Anyway, this was absolutely revolutionary for that time. So much so that these legitimate and illegitimate titles, where he would say this doesn't authorize you to conquer, this does authorize you to conquer. Well, they didn't please King Charles III because for him it didn't mean that Spain had a right to conquer what it was discovering. So he tried to get the theologians to stop expressing these opinions on these topics, but without success as they continued to express them, and those views were largely incorporated into the laws. That is, this is quite different from what we've been told. Not just the black legend from foreign countries that was imposed during this period, especially against Spain, but also from what we've been taught in school. In Spain, history textbooks don't teach any of this in depth, nothing at all. On the contrary, they're often full of the black legend, many times. I felt it was important to mention this here. And yes, the black legend has reached completely absurd levels today. They even go so far as to say that back then, well, Spain didn't really exist. In fact, they say that Spain didn't exist until the 19th century. There will always be someone who says that Spain still doesn't exist, of course, but we've already heard Motolinía talk about the Spanish nation. In his own letter to Charles III, he first talks to him about the Spanish nation, just like that, using those words. It wouldn't mean the same as it does today, but it already upends the thinking of many people who deny these things today. In fact, all the conquerors and all those people who went to the New World considered themselves Spanish, regardless of whether they were from Castile, Aragon, or any other place. They always call themselves Spanish, always, always. The first island they arrive at is Hispaniola. The first large territory conquered is New Spain. Look at this fact. In Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the phrase, "we Spaniards," is mentioned 135 times when they talk about themselves. 135 times. He only mentions the word Castilians once, and it's to say this: we are from within Castile, what they call Old Castile. He's talking about himself, his town, Medina del Campo, and they called us by the nickname Castilians. And he talks about someone else. He says, the captain who is now in Zempoal and the people he has with him, that is, those who are with him, are from another province called Vizcaya, and they have a twisted way of speaking. He says it just like that, literally. They should speak what is now known as Basque. And if you don't think that's good, I can tell you that in Cortés's letters of relation, they refer to themselves as Spaniards 429 times. That is, 135 times in Bernal's, 429 in the letters of relation, which is a shorter text. There are only 5 letters. Castellanos are mentioned as currency. There was a coin called the Castellano. And he mentions a group of Castilians once, because specifically among a group he had left somewhere. They were all Castilians, and he thought they were dead, but in the end, they were alive. This is in one of the letters of relation. But for the rest, when he refers to themselves and everyone who was there, he always talks about Spaniards. So this was the awareness that all those people who, by the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 19th, were going there, Spain had been unified since the Catholic monarchs. And I also want to talk here about a kind of absurd phenomenon generally called Malinche, and its derivative, Malinchismo. Well, so much so that even right now in Mexico, there is a movement that labels as Malinchista those who in some way helped the Spanish, accusing them of being traitors. Because of you, we no longer eat our fellow men. It must be something like that. But anyway, in the end, this is also nonsense, the whole Malinche thing. Because Doña Marina, who was the translator, the interpreter as they called her, who always accompanied Cortés and others who went with him, at some point in history, she started being called Malinche. And that's a mistake, because Doña Marina was never ever in her time called Malinche by anyone. Never. La Malinche doesn't exist. Malinche was Cortés. Bernal says this, "Before I go any further, I want to say that in all the towns we passed through, and in others where they had heard of us, they called Cortés Malinche, and so I will call him from now on Malinche. In all the conversations we had with any of the Indians, they called him Malinche. The reason they gave him this name is that since Doña Marina, our interpreter, was always in his company, for that reason they called Cortés the captain of Marina. And it seems that in the Nahuatl language, it was Malinche, the captain of Marina, not her, the captain of Marina. Malinche was Cortés. This name also stuck to a Juan Pérez Arteaga, a resident of Puebla, because he was always with Doña Marina and with Jerónimo de Aguilar, who was the other interpreter, the one who translated from the other language. That's why they called him Juan Pérez Malinche. To him, not to her, to another who went with her. And he says, I wanted to bring this to mind, even though there's no real reason to, so that it's understood that from now on, Cortés is called Malinche. And I know that Malinche is said to have meant Malinchin, Malinali, twisted grass. Look, I don't care what it means. You tell me who in her time called Doña Marina Malinche. Who? Because according to all the sources I have, nobody did. Everyone called her Doña Marina. The idea that Doña Marina is Malinche is probably a very modern invention. So Malinchismo is nonsense because it would actually be Cortesismo, meaning those who were with Cortés, not the woman, right? That's how history is written, my friends. This is a mess. Because who works on history? Who should work on it in the first place? Historians. That's what they're trained for, right? Historians. Why have historians in Spain in recent centuries hidden the best parts of our history, distorted it, or even directly lied about it? In recent years, there has been an awakening and books are starting to be written against the Black Legend. It's curious. And this also relates to everything I've told you. Look, I've quickly compiled a list of 20 books, which I won't go into detail about. But just so you know, back in 1893, a Charles F. Loomis, who was a journalist and writer, wrote, "The Spanish Pioneers, Spanish Explorers of the 16th Century, a vindication of Spain's colonizing actions in America." And mind you, he's Anglo-Saxon, not a Spaniard. Julian Huderius does appear, probably a key man in this matter. Historian, journalist, sociologist, translator, he was everything. In 1914, he was already writing about the legend. That is, someone appears, but it's been more than a century since he started defending Spain's history a bit. A Swede, someone named Sverker Arnoldsson, who already in 1953 wrote about the origins of the Spanish Black Legend. He's a historian, but he's not Spanish. There's another one, Ricardo Garcia Carcel, who in 1992 wrote The Demon of the South. The same occurs with Alfredo Alvar Esquerra, who also wrote The Black Legend in 1997. And from there, very recently, a kind of small boom about the Black Legend has started to appear. Jose Antonio Baca de Osma, this man is a diplomat, politician, writer, etc. He wrote The Empire and the Black Legend in 2004, he is not a historian. From here, the historians disappear. It seems so. We have to jump to 2014 when an architect, Ivan Velez, writes about the Black Legend. In 2017, the bestseller by Elvira Roca Varela appears. She is a philologist, not a historian. Alberto G. Ibanez, who has written many things about this, in 2018 talks about the history of hatred towards Spain. This man is a doctor-in-law and in religious studies. In other words, there are few historians here. Joseph Perez, a Frenchman, writes The Black Legend in 2018. Uncle Luis Díaz del Rio Martinez, he is a rear admiral in the General Corps of the Navy. He talks about the Black Legend. Very well. Pedro Insua writes Spain Against Its Ghosts. This man is a philosopher from the school of Gustavo Bueno. Elvira Roca Varela again talks about Fracasologia in 2019. Philologist, as we have said, Stanley J. Payne, American, in defense of Spain. Notice either the historians come from abroad or here in Spain they are anything but historians. I mean in terms of their background, although the work they are doing is outstanding. That must be said. Alberto Ibanez appears again in 2020 with The Cultural War, The Internal Enemies of Spain. In 2021, Marcelo Gullo Olmedo, an Argentine political scientist of Italian origin, writes Madre Patria. Marcelo Gullo returns in 2022 with nothing to apologize for. He was reacting a bit to these statements by the president of Mexico, López Obrador. In 2022, another book appears, Hollywood Against Spain, Esteban Vicente Guaso. The political scientist Marcelo Gullo returns with another book, What America Owes to Spain. Javier Rubio Donce in 2023, Spain Against Its Black Legend. This man is an architect. Where are the Spanish historians to defend their history and the great feats and the key figures who carried them out? Where are you, gentlemen historians? Let's see if you write something, because the last 15 books of the last 30 years that talk about the Black Legend, none of them are yours. It's a shame what history is like around the world in general, but Spanish history is a disaster. History is the most prostituted of all disciplines, and politicians and historians are its main pimps. That's how it is. Therefore, knowing the facts for sure, investigating them is extremely difficult. But I think it's a crime that even the citizens of a country like Spain are taught precisely those theories that denigrate the history of their country, when it has a magnificent, brilliant, fantastic history and an imperial period worthy of study and of being proclaimed everywhere. Well, not only is that not the case, but it's either hidden or denigrated. And don't think that's something from recent years or from democracy or from the previous regime. No. This has been happening for the last 2 centuries, practically. All this work that Hernán Cortés did, the conquest of Mexico, as he himself said in one of his last meetings with the emperor, when he practically grabbed onto the carriage because the emperor didn't want to see him anymore. He gave him the Marquisate of the Valley and refused to give more. He deserved at least the governorship of New Spain and so on. He said to him, "Your Majesty, I have given you more lands than those you inherited from your parents." And he was right. He had given him a territory immensely larger than what Spain had had up to that point. This is Hernán Cortés. He is our Alexander the Great. And today he is a figure reviled by Spaniards themselves. It's truly crazy. Look at this fact. Hernán Cortés in Spain has, I think, 2 statues. One in his hometown, which has already been vandalized. They covered it with red paint a few years ago and so on. And another one in Cáceres, which they haven't taken down yet. In Mexico, there must be a bust of him in a hospital he founded, inside the hospital. Not outside, inside. So they don't throw it in a dumpster if it's left outside. Well, in exchange, Spain, our Spain, has dedicated a bunch of statues to those who betrayed her, those who staged a coup, who caused a civil war in the Americas, like Simón Bolívar or Martí or people like that. I don't know if you know that, compared to the 2 statues of Cortés, Simón Bolívar, the great traitor to Spain, has 14 statues erected in Spain. 14. Don't think it was the latest politicians who put them up. Politicians, city councils, or whoever. No. There are 2. one from the 70s and another from 1974. The one from the 70s, when Arias Navarro was mayor of Madrid, he put up a statue of Simón Bolívar. I don't know exactly how that came about. It's not just today that we have clueless politicians who don't know what's happening. No. This is already a tradition in Spain. There are also statues of José Martí, José Rizal, and all those who betrayed Spain in an utterly vile and shameless way. In fact, they made Spain lose all its territory at a moment of weakness after the French invasion and so on. What's more, they sold that territory to the English, because that's what they did. Even today, they owe money to the English, who took all the gold and all the money that was in the coffers of the Viceroyalty of Peru, the Rio de la Plata, and New Spain. And they divided what used to be 3 large territories into more than 20 countries, and many of them are still in debt to England. To top it off, the United States took half of Mexico's territory after it became independent. Aside from the fact that the indigenous people lost the rights that the crown had granted them, all these laws we've been talking about and many others and so on, the great massacres of indigenous people happened right after independence, precisely because of these reasons. But that's not how it's told. It's told the other way around, because everyone tells the story however they want. I've already explained what history is. I've already explained it to you. But anyway, hatred for what is ours is even preached on television. Recently, talking about Hernán Cortés precisely, about this man who conquered a magnificent territory, an influencer on television, a real influencer, not these internet ones nowadays who've only been around for 5 or 6 years and have actually had influence. No. Someone who's been on TV for 40 years, starting when there was only one public channel everyone watched. On a TV show, she shouted hysterically, Cortés was an incredible murderer, a villain, and so on. Well, these are the people who have been shaping the opinion of Spaniards for the last half century, for example. And there they are. These are the real influencers. And this is what we have here in Spain. Don't overthink it. This is how it is. Spain has never defended itself against its enemies. Most of them are on the inside, to be honest. It has never, ever defended itself against its enemies. And it's incredible that despite that, it hasn't already exploded, right? We don't know if we're about to or if it could happen any day now. But of course, it has never, ever defended itself against its enemies. And obviously, that's not something positive that we can be proud of, right? Well, my friends,
En esta ocasión yo venía a hablar
Bernal Díaz del Castillo, about the philosophy behind that conquest of New Spain, that conquest of the Americas, about what was just and what was unjust. I haven't told you how the conquest unfolded. For that, you can read many books that are out there, including the account by Bernal Díaz del Castillo himself, which is a magnificent story. And that's why it's called The True History of the Conquest of New Spain. Another day I'll talk to you about something else. See you later, friends.